Good day, ma'am, and I am Lawrence Liminol E. Magnanao, and I am a professor criminology student from University of Mindanao, and I'm going to report and discuss the linear programming simple maximization method contains less than symbol. So, the linear programming simplex method is an iterative optimization technique used to solve linear programming problems. Linear programming involves maximizing or minimizing a linear objective function subjects to a set of linear equality and inequality constraints. The simplex method was developed by George Danzig in the 1940s and remains one of the most widely used algorithms for solving linear programming problems. So, what is initial simplex tableau? It is used to perform row operation on the linear programming models as well for checking optimality and entering variable the most negative entry of the bottom row of the variable and the departing variable the smallest non-negative ratio of the column determined by the entering variable. So the pivot element, it is found where the pivot row and the pivot intersect. And the pivot column, the column where the most negative entry in the bottom row of the variable is located. So, and the pivot row where the most non-negative ratio is located. So these are the steps for solving a linear programming problem using simplex method. So the step one, transform the objective function and the constraint into system of linear equation by adding slack variables. And step two, set up the initial simplex W. And step three, determine the pivot column, pivot element, and the pivot row. Transform all entries in the pivot column to zero except for the pivot element. And step 4, repeat the step 3 using the new W until there is no negative entry in the last row anymore. Then we can already determine the maximizing solution in the lower right corner from the table. So this is my first world problem. So, Richard holds two part-time jobs, job one and job two. He never wants to work more than a total of 12 hours a week. He has determined that for every hours he works at job one, he needs 2 hours to preparation time, and for every hours he works at job two, he needs 1 hour of preparation time, and he cannot spend more than 16 hours for preparation. If he can make 60 pesos an hour and job in at job one and 50 pesos an hour at job two, how many hours should he work per week each job to make his income? So this is my solution. Uh, so step one, set up the problem, write the objective function and the constraints. Since the simplex method is used for problems that consist uh, of any variables, usually use the variables of the x, y, and z, and etc. stu, st or u to represent the slacks variables. So let x now equals number of hours per week. Richard will work at job 1. Y y equals a number of hours per week. Richard will work at job 2. Maximize z equals 40x plus 30y. Subject to x plus y is less than 12. 2, 2x, 2x plus y is less than 16. X, y is greater than 0. So proceed to next step 2. Convert the inequalities into equations. For the This is done by adding one slack variables in each inequality. Observe this picture, ma'am. And for the objective function, negative 40 plus negative 30 y z equals to 0 for the constraints. X plus y plus s equals 20. 20. 2x plus y equals to 16. X plus x, y is greater than to 0. So, to step 3, construct the initial simplex W, and its equality are, is appears in own row. The non-negative consents do not appear as a row in the simplex W. Write the objective functions as well as the bottom row. Okay, now the inequalities are converted to equations. We can represent the problems into an augmented matrix called the initial simplex W's as follows. Step 4. Determine the pivot column, pivot element, and the pivot row. The pivot column is the column that the most negative entry in the row, the last row. In the table above, the column for x has the most negative entry for negative 40 at the last row. Thus, column x is the positive pivot column. So I have a question here. So why do we choose the most negative entry in the bottom row? So this is my answer is the most negative entry in the bottom row represent the largest coefficient in the objective function. The coefficient whose entry will increase the value of the objectives functions and the quiz case, and the simplex method begins as the corner points where the main variables, the variables that have symbols such as x, y, and s, t, and etc. It then moves from a corner point to the adjacent corner point, always increasing the value of the objective function. In the case of the objective function, functioning, z is equal to 40, x is plus 30y, it will make more sense to increase the value of x rather than y. The variable x represent the number of hours per week. Richard works at job 1 since job 1 pays 40 pesos per hour. As the supposed to uh po, supposed to the variable x will increase the objective function by the 40 pesos for the unit of increase in the variable x. Okay. After determining the pivot column, we then proceed to with findings pivot row. Okay. To determine the pivot row, we need to divide each entry in the constant column with the corresponding non-zero entry than the pivot column. So we do not include the last row in this procedure. The row that corresponds uh, to the smallest positive equation in the pivot rule, the pivot rule and the pivot column intercept the intersect the pivot element. Okay, so in this order to calculate the equation, we divide the entries in the far right column by the entries is called 1, uh, including the entry is the bottom row. So the smallest of the two equations, so equations, the smallest of two patience 12 and the 8 is therefore row 2 is identified the intersection of column 1 and row is the entry 2 which has been highlighted. This is our pivot element. So observe the picture, ma'am, and after this, I, I have a question. Why do we find questions and why does the smallest question identified a row? The answer is when we choose the most negative entry. Uh, when we choose the most negative entry is the bottom row, we are trying to increase the value of the objective function by bringing the variable x, but we cannot choose any value for x. Can we let x equals to 100? Differently or not? Oh, that is because Richard never wants to work for more than 12 hours at the boss job combined. So x plus y less than 12 in can we let x equal 12? Oh, again the answer is no because the preparation time for job 1 is two times the time spent on the job since Richard never wants to spend more than 16 hours for preparation. The maximum time she can work is 16 divided 2 is equal 8. Okay, using the questions uh, to identify the pivot element guarantees that we do not violate the consent. So the pivot rule, then the second row and the pivot element is 2. Note that pivot element should be positive 2 is plus 2 if there's not divide its entry in the pivot row pivot row by the pivot element. The resulting row will be used in the pivot row. So another question, why do we identify the pivot element? My answer is, as I have mentioned earlier, the simplex method begins with a corner point and moves to the next corner point, always improving the value of the objective function. The value of the objective function is improved by changing the number of units of the variables. We may add the numbers of units of one variable while throwing away the units of another pivoting allows us to do that. Okay, the variables whose units are being added is called the entering variable, and the variable whose units are being replaced is called departing variable. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the explanation of that. The entering variables in the above table A is x, and it is was determined by the most negative entry, the bottom row. Departing variable t was identified by the lowest of all quotient. Now for the next table, we use the pivoting obtain the row echelon form of augmented matrix. Uh, so pivoting is a process of obtaining one in one location of the pivot element and then making all the another entries zeros in the column, and our job is to make our pivot element. So one by dividing the entire second by row by 2. Result follows in here. in above the picture. Obtain a zero in the entry first above the pivot element. We multiply the second row by -1 and add into row 1. We get, okay, to obtain the zero limit. We multiply the second row by 40 and add it into the last row. So we now determine the basic solution associated with this W by really choosing y is equals 0 when s equals 0, with obtain x is equal 8, x is equal 8 and s is equal for 4. Okay, for the z is equal to 320 and the stage of the problems in it reads that Nick, James, Richard worked 8 hours at job 1 and no hours at chapter 2 where profit Z will be 320 pesos or corner point is equals 4 and T is equal to 0 mean that C will never left with 4 hours in working time and no preparation time. So let's proceed to the step 5. When there are no more negative entries in the bottom row, we finished. Otherwise, we start again from step 4. Okay. Since this is still a negative entry, -10 is the bottom row. We need to begin with again from step 4. And this time we will not repeat the details of every steps. Instead, we will identify the column and row that gives us the pivot element and highlight the pivot elements. Okay. Observe this picture, ma'am. We make the pivot element 1 by multiplying row 1 by 2 and we get this. We no longer have negative entries in the bottom row. They are finished. Okay. Then another question is why our finished are non-negative entries in the bottom row. So my answer is the slice the bottom row corresponds on equation 0x plus 0y plus 20s1 plus 10 plus z. Equal 400, okay? Or z is equal to 400, negative 20, y in negative 10t since all variables are not negative. The highest value can ever achieve is 400 and that will happen only when s and d are 0. So we now read our answer that is we determine the basic solutions associated with the final simplex W. Again, we look at the columns that have 1 and other entries. Zeros since the columns labeled as S and D are not such columns. They we are arbitrarily choose S is equals U and T is equals and get the matrix with X is equal for Y is equals 8 and Z is equals 400 and final solution says that Richard works 4 hours and shows that work at job 2. Uh, Since both slack variables are 0, it means that slow shows that he have used up the working time as well as the preparation time and none will be left. Okay. So for my word problem number two, so suppose a manufactures different electrician components for computers. Components requires 2 hours of fabrications and 1 hour for assembly. Component B requires 3 hours of fabrication and 1 hour of assembly, and component C requires 2 hours of fabrication and 2 hours of assembly. The company has up to 1,000 labor hours for fabrication and fabrication, and 800 labor hours assembly time each week if the profit on its component A, B, and C is 7 pesos and 8 pesos and 10 pesos respectively. How many uh how many of it should be proceed to maximize profit? So was a stick one. Let x be the number of the A. Y is the number of the component B. S will be the component C. Maximus P is equal to 7 x plus 8 y plus 10 s. X y s is less than no greater than 0. Subject to 2x plus 3y plus 2x is less than 1,000, and x plus y plus 2s is less than 800. So step 2 for the objective function, we have converted our inequalities into equations. So for the objective function, negative 7x negative 8, the y in negative 10 plus p equal to 0. For constraints, 2x plus 3y plus 2s is is less than 1,000, and x plus y plus 2s 2s is less than 800, with x y s is greater than 0. So that's step 3. We have we have set up our simplex tablet. So observe this picture, ma'am, and so we will determine our pivot column before element and pivot row. In the table above, the column S has the most negative entry of the negative 10 uh, is the last row. Okay, so those column as is the pivot column. Our pivot row is 2 because it has the smallest equation, and our pivot element is also 2. So the step is the pivot one. So that's step 5. After determining the pivot column, pivot element, the pivot row, we are able to use pivoting the obtain one of the location of pivot element and all the columns. So now we have divide the entire row by 2 to make our pivot element 1. A A1. A 1. Observe the picture, ma'am, of the above, and we have to we have to divide 1 over 2 to row to get our new row 2. Row 2. So we the get the show this shown in the table. Okay, so uh, you are now to get our new one by dividing 2 in the row 2. Uh, and add the wrong one to get on on the new row 1. Okay, so now our job is to get the new row 3 by dividing pivot column, which is negative 10, but we have to change it positive, and it becomes 10, so we can get 0 0.1 0 excuse me. So in the table above, we have all the new roles, but unfortunately we have not finished yet because it is not yet 0 in the x and y is, so we have to repeat and what we do in the step 5. So we divide the two we had to divide first row in the 1 over 2 to get our new row 1 so also in this picture above shows the so in the table above, so then we have to get a new row 2 and row 3. To get the new row 2, we have to divide again the 1/2 of row 1 and add row 2. And after divide the positive 3 with our pivot column to row 1 and add row 3 to get the row 3. Then we have, so observe the picture, the table in this picture is finally there's no negative in this row 3, which is done. So okay, so our solution is maximum when x is equals to 100, s is equal to 300, is y is equal to 0, and t is equal to 0, u is equal u max profit of one 4,400 pesos. So okay, this is our end of word problem number 2, and let's proceed to next problem number 3. This is So for the third world problem is Stark Company produced 3 types of chairs. There are 3 sections using advanced machines and equipments to complete each type. Type A requires 10 minutes of melting and refining, 15 minutes of cutting, and 8 minutes for quality check and packaging. Type B requires 12 minutes of melting and refining, 14 minutes for cutting, and 6 minutes for quality check and packaging. Type C requires 12 minutes of melting and refining, 20 minutes of cutting, and 8 minutes for quality check and refining. Time at 12 every week. Refining one quality melting refining is 1,500 minutes. 1,550 minutes. So remember natin to kasi magagamit po natin to. 1,000 minutes for cutting and 1 minutes for and 800 minutes for quality check. Uh, Suppose a profit of every check generate 20 pesos, 30 pesos, and 50 pesos respectively. How many times should be reproduced obtain maximum profit? So, gamitin natin yung let x. Let x sub 1 equals the number of type A star. Let x sub 2 equals the number of type base chair. Let x sub 3 equals the number of type C chair. So, maximize natin yung Z. Maximize natin yung Z, ma'am. And 20x sub 1 plus 20x sub 2 plus 50x sub 3. So, saan to nanggaling? Itong 20, 30, and 50, ito yung peso. Ito yung peso. Ito po yung peso, ma'am. Tapos, subjected to 10x sub 1 plus x, 12x sub 2 plus 12x sub 3 less than to 1,500. Nakuha po ito sa, ito po. Dito po yung nakuha sa mga melting and interfining. Sa type A is 10 minutes. Sa type B is 12. So, ano yun? Sa type 10, 12, 10, 12, 12, and oh, same lang sa ano. Same lang po dito. Sa 15, 14, and 20, and 1,000. Dito ko yung ginawa sa 15, 14, and where's that? 20. Ito. 15, 14, and 20. Then 10, 12, 12. Dito po. Same lang sa quality checking. Ito rin po. Same lang sa quality checking. X sub 1, x sub 2, x sub 3 is greater than 0. So, step 1. For objective function, ah, nag-transpose, di ba dito yun kanina? Nag-transpose tayo dito sa x3. Oh, objective to. So, ito ma'am, naglagay na po tayo ng mga variable dito. Then, subjective to 2. Subjective to this. Kanina. No. And ito na yung, ano, W. So, basic variable stuz. This is the slack variables and x x1 x sub 1, x sub 2, x sub 3, x s x t u and rx is uh, this rx is or right. So this stands for right hand sign. So nag-substitute lang tayo dito ng mga variable, ma'am. Oh, s is 1. Then the rest is 0 na. Kasi ano, so S lang meron tayo sa 15 minutes. So 0 na sila the rest. 0 na po to. 1,5 dito. Same dito ma'am. Kung ano yung variable na nandito sa same lang sa 1. So next is uh, dito yung makita yung mga pivots kanina po. So may label po tayo dito. This is called pivot element. So ito yung pivot element. Then ito yung tinatawag na pivot row. Pivot R. Obviously, and also this is the pivot column. Hmm. Ah. So bakit ito naging pivot row? So just like I said kanina, ito yung nasa smallest quotient. So 15 divided by 12. So, siya yung nasa loob ng pivot column. So, i-divide natin sa 1,000 divide 20. Oh, this is clear. So, for the, this is clearly 2, 3, 5. So, sino yung pinakamaliit na value na quotient? Oh, so 50. 50 yung may pinakamaliit na value. Hmm, Next is make the pivot element equal to 1. So, 15, 15, 14. Copy lang ito. 20, 0, 1, 0, 0, then 1,000. Then 14, 20, 0, 1, 0, 1. So, copy lang natin dito. Fifth, ito na. 15, 14, 20, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1,000. Then, ito makukuha mo after dividing the pivot element niya po. Then, ito, no? After dividing it, mm, then, after, if makuha yung result, i-substitute mo din dito, ma'am. Then, ito yung magiging entering variable natin and this is our living variable. Transfer all integers in a pivot column to 0 except pivot element. Gagawin natin itong 0, ito at ito, except sa pivot element. Multiplying pivot row by 12. Bakit negative 12, ma'am? So, di ba gagawin natin itong 0 except nito. Ah, Negative 12 para negative 12 para multiply, and basta i-multiply mo lang dito po and add the product of the row 1 to the old entries of row 1, obtain new row 1. Oh, ito yung old row 1 natin and ito yung product kanina. Tapos i-add natin and yung sum, ito yung magiging row S or row 1. Oh, siya na naging yung new row 1. Ang hirap. Ito po. 18/5. Then ito, same lang. Same lang po. So, do this row U and Z. Makukuha nyo na ang row U at row Z. Ah, ito yun. So, ang ask kanina, how many times did you produce? Ito po, na-maximize na po natin yung ano. Once wala na yung negative sa pinakababa, so kanina may negative pa yung tatlo. So ngayon wala na, nakuha natin yung mga negative. So, therefore, kasi wala negative dito, uh, nakuha natin yung maximum ng mga simplex method. Ito po. Sabi nito. Therefore, O, ito po ma'am, for checking na po ito. Mag-conclude muna po tayo. Therefore, this would be less than is equal to 2012 to 5 to 5 2,500 types to be produced to obtain maximum profit. So, paano tayo nakaka-sure na tama po itong 2,500? X3, X50. Bakit? X3. Where na yun? Where na yun? Kalat na. X3. 50. So, X sub 3 is equal to 50 and X sub 1 is equal to 0. Then X sub 2 0 kasi wala siya dito sa basic variables na column. Nasa row lang siya. T is 0. Bakit? Kasi siya yung living variable natin. Living, umalis na. So, ang value na is 0. Yung yung S natin is 900. Ito yung S. Ito yung S, then yung value ng S 900. Then yung value ng U is 400. Bakit 400? Kasi so, ang value ng RHS na is 400. Tapos, yung Z natin is yun yung, yun yung should be produced or para makuha natin ang maximum profit. Ito na po yun. So, substitute lang. I-check nyo to sa calculator. Ito dapat ang magiging result po. Once tama na po yun dito. Therefore, pag tama na po yung nandito, tama na yung lumabas ito. Therefore, tama yung solving po natin. Yun lang po ma'am. Thank you po.